Okay. Chapter 5 covered the two kind of what we think of as the organs of the cardiovascular system. And here in Chapter 6, we're going to focus on kind of the thing that's transported through the cardiovascular system, which is our blood. And this will be pretty quick because we covered blood as a type of tissue in Chapter 4. So we're kind of already familiar with the cells of blood, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of their main functions. So we're only going to be looking at sections 2, 3, and 4 for Chapter 6. And that's going to cover what are the 3 cell types that are found in blood, and what are each of their specialized functions. So going to be another excellent example of form follows function, because we're going to see 3 very unique shapes of cells when we're looking at these 3 different types of blood cells: red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Red blood cells, something we're probably the most familiar with, and these are called erythrocytes. Another, the scientific word for red blood cells. And we've seen already that these guys are highly specialized for transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide. And their shape, their biconcave disc shape, gives them more surface area for transporting those very important molecules. The other cool thing that we haven't seen yet about red blood cells is, in order to make up enough space to carry the most oxygen that it can, or the most carbon dioxide that it can, on the inside of a red blood cell, it has no nucleus and no organelles. So none of that stuff that we talked about being really important in cells. No nucleus, so no DNA. No endoplasmic reticulum, so no ribosomes for making its own proteins. It has to come out and be produced and have everything that it needs ready to go. And these guys are going to be produced in the bone marrow. So because they have no nucleus and no DNA, red blood cells are not able to divide and make copies of themselves. So they're not able to replace themselves. And that's why they're going to be generated from our bone marrow. We'll talk more about that when we get to the skeletal system. But not having all of those extra organelles inside the cell makes more room for the all-important hemoglobin. And this is the protein contained within a red blood cell that is actually able to bind oxygen or carbon dioxide, and bind both of them. And it is a kind of a highly complex protein made of these 4 different strands of protein or amino acids. So when we talked about proteins, we talked about them having primary structure, secondary structure, and tertiary structure. The primary structure was the individual sequence of amino acids. The secondary structure was whether it was pleated or having a helical shape. And then that tertiary structure was how it was folded up on each other. And we remember, hopefully, that tertiary structure is the important the important thing that keeps the functional section of that protein faced toward the outside so that it can do its job. And the functional portion of hemoglobin is called the heme group. Where's my mouse? There we go. Here's the heme group. So in each of those individual links of protein that work together, there's a single heme group, and there's an atom of iron in the middle. And the iron is what can bind oxygen or bind carbon dioxide and carry it with it. And that's going to be through that temporary sharing of electrons, bonding, right? So it can bind oxygen or bind carbon dioxide to the heme group, the iron group of a molecule of hemoglobin. So a single molecule of hemoglobin can then carry 4 molecules of oxygen or 4 molecules of carbon dioxide, 1 at each heme group. And because these red blood cells are not, they don't have anything else taking up their space, they're jam-packed with hemoglobin. So that increases their efficiency at being able to carry the most oxygen from the lungs or carry the most carbon dioxide back to the lungs to be breathed out. White blood cells are our leukocytes. The scientific name for white blood cells is leukocytes. These are much larger than our red blood cells, and they're highly specialized for fighting infection. So we'll see these again when we talk about the immune system, because they play a big role in our body's immune response. They do that by having the ability to undergo phagocytosis. Phago, remember, means eating, and cytosis is one of those examples of endocytosis, bringing something into the cell through the use of that plasma membrane. So not diffusion, because it's not going straight through the phospholipid bilayer, and not facilitated diffusion, because it's not, these items are too large to go through a carrier protein. So we are going to use phagocytosis, this example of endocytosis, to bring a bacteria or something into the cell. Surround the bacteria with the use of the plasma membrane, pinch it off, making a vesicle around it out of the cell's plasma membrane, and then these guys are going to be chock full of those lysosomes. So the tiny little organelles floating around that have those digestive enzymes on the inside. So now this vesicle, mouse keeps disappearing, this vesicle can fuse with a lysosome and be basically eaten by the cell. Phagocytosis. The kind of wild thing about white blood cells is that they can leave the bloodstream and go to other tissues to fight infection. So if you have an infection of the, let's say you've got like a respiratory infection in your lung tissue, and your body has said, oh my gosh, we are sick, we need help over here, your white blood cells can leave the bloodstream, leave the like the confines of the arteries and veins, and they can go out into your lung tissue to help fight that infection. If it's a bacteria or a virus, it will do that within the tissue itself. And so bacteria is largely dealt with through this endocytosis, phagocytosis. If it were to be a virus, a viral infection, then white blood cells have the ability to produce antibodies, something that we've heard about a lot lately during and learned about kind of on the go during the pandemic. And this is if you're exposed to a virus or a bacteria too, but mostly virus. The outside of the virus is going to be covered in what we call an antigen, and it's a specific protein that our bodies don't recognize as being part of our body. It's flagging it as foreign. Some of those glycoproteins that are on our cells telling our body this belongs here. Bacteria are going to have a different one, and a virus is going to have a different one. And once we have identified that cell as being not of our own, the white blood cell will learn how to create the antibody. And that's what marks it kind of for destruction. Get rid of this cell, it does not belong here. And that's the job of our white blood cells. And then lastly, we have our platelets, our thrombocytes. And these are specialized for coagulation or clotting. So if a vessel is damaged, obviously blood is going to start seeping through. You've got a paper cut, and you know that bleeding stops very, very quickly because of coagulation or clotting, the action of our platelets. So if you have a damage to the blood vessel, like has happened here, blood's going to start leaving. These platelets, which are the teeny tiny little cells, even smaller than red blood cells, they're going to arrive at that site of damage, and they're going to start creating a protein called fibrin. Long strands of fibrin, a very strong protein. And that's going to create kind of like a net. and it's going to collect platelets and red blood cells and maybe some white blood cells. And that fibrin is creating what we call a clot, because as it collects enough cells to be able to be large enough where it can't pop out of the part of the broken vessel, then that's what's going to create the clot. It's going to plug up that area that has been damaged, and then obviously we will heal over the top of that or over the bottom of that, and that clot will, or that scab that we make, will fall off. But that's all because those platelets are creating that long strand of protein called fibrin. So sometimes if you have like a condition like hemophilia, that the issue is that you're not creating fibrin or not creating enough fibrin. So you're not going to clot and you're going to continue bleeding, which obviously would be detrimental to the functioning of your cardiovascular system. So that's one example of if that particular cell type isn't functioning as expected, what the consequences might be. So hopefully after this section you could name the 3 cell types that are found in blood and what each of their specialized functions are. And to help you review the cardiovascular system as a whole, both chapters 5 and 6, here are a couple of thought questions that you might consider as you're studying for our next test. I'm not going to discuss them on the video here, but if you are struggling to come up with maybe what the correct answers would be, or if you just want to discuss it in more detail, shoot me an email and we can set up a time to do that. And I do hope to hear from you.